5 seemingly forgotten massacres and mass murders. 1. Joseph Thayer. On the afternoon of Monday, October 12, 1896, 17-year-old George Albert Thayer returned to his family farm after spending a weekend away visiting friends in a nearby town. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields. But a sense of foreboding clouded George's mind as he approached the familiar grounds. Upon entering the farm, his heart sank as he caught sight of something haunting in the stockyard, a mere 91 meters, 300 feet, from the entrance of his home. There, swinging from a beam, was the lifeless body of his father, 44-year-old Joseph Thayer. Frantic and filled with dread, George sprinted toward the house, calling out for his family. As he burst through the door, a scene of utter horror met his eyes. Inside, the bloodied and disfigured remains of his mother and younger siblings lay sprawled across the floor. His mother, 36-year-old Elizabeth, and his younger siblings, 12-year-old Florence, 9-year-old Edward, 7-year-old Alexander, 6-year-old Charlie, and 4-month-old Roy, had suffered unspeakable violence. Their skulls bore the marks of a brutal attack inflicted by an unknown blunt weapon. Some of the victims had been struck so violently that the upper portions of their skulls were entirely removed, leaving behind a gruesome tableau. In a tragic turn of events, Joseph Thayer had unleashed a wave of violence upon his family before taking his own life, leaving George to grapple with the horrifying aftermath. It would be another 2 agonizing days before the authorities arrived to remove the corpses from the scene. In those 3 blistering days, the oppressive heat intensified the already unbearable stench of death and decay, forcing the undertaker to rely on the strongest disinfectants available in a futile attempt to mask the horrific odor that permeated the air. News of the massacre spread like wildfire through the nearby settlements, leaving residents in shock and disbelief. Joseph Thayer was widely regarded as a reserved and respectable man in Cavanagh, South Australia. He had been known for his quiet demeanor and good standing in the community, making the brutality of his actions all the more incomprehensible. Yet beneath his facade lay a man with a violent temper, and in the weeks leading up to the tragedy, he had been overheard complaining of pains in his head, a detail that would haunt the community as they tried to make sense of the horrors that had unfolded. On October 14th, the day of the funeral, Elizabeth and Florence were carefully placed in a single casket, their bodies lovingly arranged by the grieving family members. The 4 boys were interred in 2 separate coffins, 2 brothers per coffin, a poignant reminder of their lost innocence. All 4 caskets were lowered into the ground together, a somber union in one grave, symbolizing the bond of family that had been so violently severed. In stark contrast to the shared resting place of his victims, the body of Joseph Thayer, the man who had committed such heinous acts, was buried alone in a separate plot. This final separation served as a grim testament to the tragedy that had unfolded, leaving behind a community forever scarred by the brutality of one man's actions. The echoes of that fateful day would linger in the hearts and minds of the residents of Cavanagh, a haunting reminder of the fragility of life and the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most respected individuals. 2. Frederick Bailey Yeming. Frederick Bailey, deeming a notorious con man and murderer, had already led a tumultuous life filled with criminal exploits by the time he married Marie James in England in 1881. Throughout his life, Yeming was no stranger to prison. He had spent the majority of his adult years cycling in and out of incarceration for various offenses, each stint seemingly only sharpening his skills in deception and manipulation. Despite his troubled past, he managed to charm Marie, and together they had 4 children. However, the responsibilities of fatherhood and marriage did little to deter Yeming's bigamous inclinations. In 1890, he married Helen Matheson, adding yet another layer of complexity to his already chaotic life. When, as if juggling 2 families wasn't enough, Yeming's insatiable appetite for romantic conquest led him to marry a 3rd woman, Emily Lydia Mather, in September 1891. This new union was marked by a veneer of domestic bliss, yet it concealed a dark undercurrent of violence and treachery. Just 3 months after their wedding, the couple relocated to Windsor, Australia, where they rented a quaint brick cottage that still stands today at 57 Andrew Street. The peaceful exterior of their new home belied the horrors that were about to unfold within its walls. Tragically, on Christmas Day of that year, the facade of holiday cheer shattered as the charming Yeming revealed his true, sinister nature. In a brutal act of violence, he bludgeoned Emily, then callously slit her throat, before disposing of her naked body beneath the hearthstone of their bedroom. This heinous crime went unnoticed for a time, allowing Yeming to maintain a facade of normalcy. The following month, he sailed to Sydney, where he quickly became engaged to a woman named Kate Rounsefell. Yeming's charm seemed to work wonders once again, as he swept Kate off her feet, promising a future filled with love and adventure. However, their whirlwind romance was fated to be short-lived. Meanwhile, the Windsor cottage began to reveal its gruesome secret. A putrid smell emanating from the floorboards drew the attention of neighbors and ultimately led to the discovery of Emily's decomposed remains. This shocking revelation triggered Yeming's arrest in Western Australia, where the authorities began to piece together the full extent of his crimes. The news of his arrest and the circumstances surrounding Emily's death quickly traveled back to England, reaching the ears of her grieving mother. The heartbroken woman recalled suspicious floor work her son-in-law had undertaken at their former home in Rainhill. Alarmed by her recollections, local authorities excavated the floors of the couple's previous residence, only to uncover the remains of Yeming's first wife, Marie, and their 4 young children, entombed in concrete. The savagery of these crimes sent shockwaves through society, transforming Yeming into a media sensation. The press, eager for sensational stories, began to draw parallels between Yeming and the infamous Jack the Ripper, suggesting that he might be the embodiment of that elusive monster. Overnight, Yeming was branded the Jack the Ripper of the Southern Seas, a title that seemed to thrill him. Throughout his trial, he maintained a stoic silence, neither confessing to nor denying the Ripper allegations, perhaps relishing the notoriety that came with such infamy. On May 23, 1892, as the date of his execution approached, Yeming was unrepentant. He walked to the gallows in front of a raucous crowd of 12,000 eager spectators, puffing on one last cigar as if savoring the final moments of his life. The atmosphere was electric, a mix of horror and fascination, as the public grappled with the reality of a man who had descended into the depths of depravity, leaving a trail of heartbreak and tragedy in his wake. 3. The Gatten murders. On the fateful night of December 26, 1898, 3 siblings from the Murphy family, Michael, age 29, and his sisters Nora, 27, and Teresa, affectionately known as Ellen, who was just 19, set out for a lively dance in the quaint and close-knit community of Gatten. The air was filled with the promise of celebration, as townsfolk gathered to share music, laughter, and the warmth of companionship in the midst of the summer heat. However, as dawn broke the following morning, the siblings had not returned to their family farm, igniting a wave of concern among their relatives and neighbors. Their absence prompted an immediate search effort, with worried family members and friends scouring the surrounding fields and woods. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the landscape, the search party stumbled upon a secluded pasture that would become the epicenter of a horrific discovery. There, lying side by side with their feet pointing westward, were the blood-soaked bodies of the Murphy siblings. It was a scene so chilling that it seemed almost staged, as if the callous killer had deliberately posed them in death. Investigators arriving at the scene were met with a gruesome tableau. The siblings' bodies were lifeless, their faces marred by violence, and the ground around them became a macabre stage for nature's scavengers, with ants already crawling across their pale skin. A closer examination revealed the horrifying details of their demise. Both of the sisters' hands had been bound tightly, an indication of the brutal restraint they had endured. The forensic evidence suggested a heinous act of sexual violence, with the brass-mounted handle of a riding whip implicated in the assault. The brutality of the murders was further underscored by the extent of the injuries inflicted upon the siblings. Nora, in particular, suffered such catastrophic head wounds that her brain was grotesquely exposed, obscuring her features in a ghastly display of violence. Adding to the horror of the scene was the discovery of the family's horse, found a short distance away, shot in the head. A senseless act of cruelty that left the community reeling. In the days that followed, The investigation into the murders became an example of profound incompetence and mismanagement. Authorities from Brisbane took an agonizing 2 days to reach the crime scene, and by that time the area had been thoroughly compromised by the curiosity of local onlookers who trampled through evidence and contaminated the crucial site. The botched investigation only deepened the sense of frustration and helplessness among the townspeople. As speculation ran rampant, one name emerged repeatedly in connection with the grisly crime: Thomas Day, a local butcher who had been seen lurking near the site of the murders on that fateful night. Day had already been under suspicion for the earlier killing of 15-year-old Alfred Stephen Hill, whose pony was discovered with a bullet wound to the head just weeks prior. The chilling connection between the two cases sent shockwaves through the community. In a tragic and mysterious twist, Thomas Day took his own life in 1900, shooting himself in the head at Sydney Hospital, leaving behind an unanswered question that would haunt the Gatten community for generations. Despite numerous theories and countless hours of investigation, more than a century later, the murders of the Murphy siblings remain unsolved, a grim reminder of a dark chapter in the town's history that continues to cast a long shadow over its residents. 4. Stringy Creek Massacre. In October 1878, the notorious Kelly Gang found themselves on the run, evading capture in the rugged and untamed bushlands of northeast Victoria. This remote wilderness, characterized by dense thickets and towering eucalyptus trees, served as both refuge and strategic advantage for the outlaws. As their whereabouts became increasingly narrowed down by law enforcement, the tension escalated. The Victorian government, determined to bring the gang to justice, dispatched 4 officers to apprehend them. Setting up camp at Stringy Creek, the officers believed they had positioned themselves in a suitable location to catch the criminals. Unbeknownst to the officers, the Kelly Gang was keenly aware of their movements. Nestled deep in the brush, they waited patiently, biding their time and planning their ambush. The wild, sprawling landscape offered them excellent concealment, allowing them to observe the camp without detection. On the fateful morning of the ambush, Sergeant Kennedy and Constable Scanlon made a critical mistake. Ignoring the warnings of caution, they left the safety of the camp at dawn, venturing out in search of the gang. This reckless decision left their partners, Constables Lonigan and McIntyre, vulnerable and exposed. As the sun reached its zenith and the afternoon cast long shadows over the campsite, the Kelly Gang executed their plan with chilling precision. They launched a surprise attack, swiftly overpowering the officers. Lonigan was the first to fall, shot dead almost immediately. The chilling sound of gunfire shattered the stillness of the bush, sending shockwaves through the surrounding area. McIntyre, realizing the gravity of the situation, found himself held at gunpoint. He was acutely aware of the grim fate that awaited his comrades upon their return, and a sense of dread washed over him as time dragged on. When Kennedy and Scanlon eventually returned, they were met with a hail of bullets. The chaos that ensued was chaotic and brutal. Constable Scanlon, tragically caught in the crossfire, fell to the ground, mortally wounded. In a desperate bid for survival, the unarmed McIntyre seized the opportunity to leap onto a horse that had bolted amidst the frenzy. In that moment of sheer panic, he left the doomed Kennedy behind, who was left to confront the gang alone. The aftermath of this violent encounter sparked widespread outrage among the public. The brutal execution of the officers ignited a firestorm of anger, leading the state of Victoria to formally declare the Kelly Gang as outlaws. This designation meant that it was now legal for anyone to shoot and kill Ned Kelly, Dan Kelly, Joe Byrne, and Steve Hart on sight, without the need for an attempted arrest. Despite the overwhelming odds stacked against them, remarkably, the gang managed to evade capture for another 2 years, continuing their reign of notoriety across the region. In the years that followed, the site of the ambush at Stringy Creek became a grim landmark in Australian history. Locals, drawn by a mix of morbid curiosity and fascination, began to flock to the area, eager to witness the remnants of a harrowing chapter in their nation's past. The tale of the Kelly Gang became interwoven with the identity of the bush, forever marking Stringy Creek as a symbol of lawlessness and rebellion in the annals of Australian folklore. 5. Thomas Jeffries. On December 31, 1825, A chilling series of events unfolded in Van Diemen's Land, now known as Tasmania, when Thomas Jeffries orchestrated a daring escape from the Launceston watch house. He was not alone in his flight. He was joined by three fellow inmates, John Perry, James Hopkins, and a man whose identity was only recorded as Russell. With the new year approaching, the air was thick with anticipation, but for these four men, it marked the beginning of a violent spree. That fateful evening, emboldened by their recent freedom, the quartet targeted the residence of a respected local settler named Tibbs. The Tibbs family, known for their hospitality and community contributions, were unprepared for the intrusion that was about to shatter their peaceful existence. As darkness enveloped the area, the intruders broke into the home, catching Mr. Tibbs, his wife, and their male servant off guard. The peaceful household was quickly transformed into a scene of chaos and terror as the intruders bound their victims, intent on robbery and mayhem. In the midst of the chaos, a violent struggle erupted. Desperate to escape, Mr. Tibbs and the servant attempted to resist, but their bravery was met with brutality. Shots rang out in the stillness of the night, and in moments the innocent men lay lifeless, their bodies riddled with bullets. The horror escalated as Mrs. Tibbs, now destitute and terrified, was dragged into the surrounding forest along with her infant son, whose cries pierced the night. In the shadows of the trees, isolated from the world and its comforts, Jeffries committed an unspeakable atrocity. In a moment of unfathomable cruelty, he ripped a 5-month-old baby from his mother's protective embrace and brutally smashed the child against a nearby tree. The act was not only a display of raw violence, but a manifestation of the darkness that had consumed him and his accomplices. The forest, once a serene refuge, became a graveyard of innocence. The true horrors of that night did not remain hidden for long. A week later, the local community was engulfed in dread when the mutilated remains of the infant were discovered. What was left of the child was a grotesque sight, reduced to mangled flesh and bones, a tragic testament to the primal instincts of the wild animals that roamed the area. The news sent shockwaves through the town, igniting a fervor of fear and outrage among the residents. As the manhunt for Jeffries and his accomplices intensified, the community remained on edge, haunted by the violent acts that had shattered their sense of safety. During this time, Russell, one of the escapees, met a gruesome fate at the hands of his companions, who turned on him, shooting him before resorting to cannibalism. The bond of their criminal alliance had dissolved into savagery. Days later, Jeffries and Perry were apprehended following the murder of another man, Magnus Bakey, a crime that would seal their fate. The trial that followed was a spectacle of horror and grief, particularly for Mrs. Tibbs. She, having endured unimaginable trauma, including rape and abandonment in the forest, collapsed in the courtroom upon seeing her child's killers brought to justice. Her pain resonated deeply with the jurors and the public, who had followed the case with rapt attention. On May 4, 1826, the grim saga reached its conclusion as Jeffries and Perry were led to the gallows. The townsfolk gathered to witness the execution, a somber reminder of the price of their heinous crimes. As the nooses tightened, it marked not only the end of their lives, but also the beginning of a healing process for a community scarred by violence and betrayal. The events of that fateful New Year's Eve would linger in the memories of the residents, a grim chapter in the history of Van Diemen's Land. Please don't forget to subscribe and like this video.